Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Govind Jaiswal, Director Public Health in Ministry of Health, Government of India. First, I would like to welcome Dr. Guleria sir, Dr. Rajiv, Dr. Richa Agarwal, and other team members of the AIIMS Delhi, as well as the participant and members of the Indian Medical Association. Today's agenda is that medical management, antiviral agent, and IL-6. I want to inform all the members and the participating that last time that when we did the Center of Excellence program and we disseminated information to all the states, the response that we received from the state, it was prodigious. Everybody was appraising, and I'm very much sure that this time also this conversation and this session will be very useful for others. And many yesterday program when it was telecasted that many college also approached us, and they said it was very much appropriated by them, and they were appreciating this initiative of ministry. So I'm very thankful to Dr. Guleria sir for his valuable time, and he, despite of his busy schedule. So thank you, sir. And now I would like to request Guleria sir to start the session.
Thank you very much. And at the onset, let me really thank the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare and the Indian Medical Association for really coming together and having these Center of Excellence program, because I think this is very, very important as we move forward in terms of the pandemic, and the pandemic is moving in certain areas towards rural India. It's very important for us to be up to date in terms of managing patients with COVID-19. This is a new viral infection. The knowledge as far as COVID-19 is concerned is changing every day. Newer molecules are coming in. We keep arguing about whether they are of much use or not. And we moved a lot in terms of medical management from not giving steroids to saying steroids are now very useful in moderate to severe disease, from issues of various other drugs that were given as part of medical management, including hydroxychloroquine and even drugs like lopinavir, ritonavir, to now having a more clear idea as to what works, what doesn't work, and what may work, but we need more data. We're going to try and discuss that today in terms of the in-hospital medical management, which I think is very, very important. And we have an excellent speaker, Dr. Richa Agarwal, who is a faculty here, and has vast experience in managing patients with COVID-19 who were admitted in our COVID center, which was the trauma center. And of course, we have a very good expert panel, Dr. Anjan Trikha, Dr. Anant Mohan, Dr. Manish Suneja, and Dr. Neeraj Nishtu. So I'm grateful to all of them for sparing time and being here. Since we're already a little late, without wasting much time, I'll really ask Dr. Richa Agarwal to start the session, and with her talk on in-hospital medical management, including steroids, antiviral agents, and anti-IL-6 therapy. Over to you, Dr. Richa.
Thank you, sir. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can all hear you. Please.
Okay, right, sir. Thank you, sir. I'll be discussing the in-hospital medical management of COVID-19 patients. So before we start the medical management, I just want to give you insight about what percentage of the patients they require actual hospital admission. If we see worldwide, we know that 85% of the patients of COVID-19 disease, they are either asymptomatic or have mild disease. And only 15% they have moderate to severe disease, and 5% they require critical care. But when we talk about India, according to the government data, around 6.4% of the patients, they required hospitalization up till last May, and intensive care treatment was provided in around 3% of the patients. So when we are talking about in-hospital management, we are talking about the patients, these 6 to 7% of the patients that require hospitalization. Now, what kind of patients they require hospitalization? The patients who have moderate disease or severe disease are needed to be hospitalized. Now, how do we define moderate disease? These can be judged on the clinical criteria. The patients having respiratory tract infection along with either respiratory rate more than 24 per minute, that is they are tachypneic, or hypoxic, maintaining saturation of 93% on room air. They are the patients who are categorized into the moderate disease and require admission in the ward. Then there are patients who have severe disease. These are the patients who are more hypoxic, maintaining saturation of less than 90% on room air, and more tachypnic, that is the respiratory rate is more than 30 breaths per minute. These are the patients who have severe disease, and ideally they should be managed in the intensive care unit. Now, when we talk about the management, what all treatment options we have. So apart from oxygen, which is again a treatment option, other agents which are available are antivirals, anti-inflammatory drugs, which include steroids and anti-IL-6 drugs, anticoagulants, and various supplements which are given in the COVID-19 management. I'll not be discussing about the oxygen therapy, but I'll be discussing about the pharmacotherapy options which we have. Now, what is more important, whenever we are talking about the individual drugs, it is very prudent to know that all of these drugs should not be given at the same time in the management of the patient. Each drug has to be given in a particular time in the phase of the disease process. For example, the antivirals, they should be given early in the course of the disease when there is a viral replication phase. And anti-inflammatory drugs, they should be given later in the course of the disease when there is hyperinflammation phase. When we give anti-inflammatory drugs early in the course of the disease, they can do more harm than good. So this is very important while managing the patients. AIIMS ICMR COVID-19 Task Force, they have already issued guidelines on how to manage the patients of moderate disease and severe disease. All the moderate cases, they should be admitted in the ward, and severe cases patients, they should be admitted in the ICU. When we talk about management of moderate diseases, the first thing is oxygen support. All the hypoxic patients should be given oxygen to maintain the target SpO2 between 90 to 96%. And the target is obviously less in patients who are COPD. The oxygen can be given with various interfaces. The details will be discussed in the next seminar on oxygen support. Apart from the oxygen support, the patients should be advised awake proning and sequential position change after every 2 hours. It is very important to make them realize that it is important to lie in prone position for as much possible time as they can. Adequate hydration is another important. These patients, they have high-grade fever, they are tachypnic, so they become dehydrated. So it is important to keep them ensured hydration, proper hydration. And again, symptomatic treatment in terms of antipyretics and antitussics, they should be given. Apart from this supportive management, the two most important drugs which should be given are anticoagulation and anti-inflammatory. Now, COVID-19 is a prothrombotic stage, and there are high chances of venous thromboembolism as well as arterial thrombosis. So we need to start anticoagulation in these patients. In patients who have moderate disease, we start with prophylactic dose of unfractionated heparin or low molecular weight heparin. If we give low molecular weight heparin, the dose is 0.5 mg per kg body weight subcutaneously OD, obviously after ruling out the contraindications. And in terms of anti-inflammatory, we need to start steroids. That is either the methylprednisolone or dexamethasone can be given. The dose of methylprednisolone is 0.5 to 1 mg per kg in divided doses in the moderate cases. These need to be continued for 5 to 10 days depending on the clinical situation of the patient. These patients who have moderate disease, they require close monitoring for disease progression, for seeing signs and symptoms of disease progression. The monitoring includes both clinical monitoring as well as the laboratory monitoring. In the clinical monitoring, we need to see whether the patient has change in the oxygen requirement, is he hemodynamically stable or not, is there any ventilator requirements which are increasing. In the laboratory monitoring, it is important that we should not get every test done all the time. The tests which are required, basic tests are complete blood count, baseline KFTs, baseline LFTs, they are required at the baseline, and then they can be repeated after every 1 or 2 days. ABG baseline should be done and then as required. Inflammatory markers, they can also be done once a while, that is at the baseline, and then can be repeated after 48 to 72 hours, depending on the clinical condition of the patient. IL-6 levels, they need to be done only if the patient is deteriorating. We do not need to do the lab parameters in the patient who are improving. The chest X-ray should be done initially at the time of admission, but After that, it should be repeated depending on the clinical status. And HRCT test should be done only if there is worsening of the disease status. We should not do routine CT scans in all the patients. Now coming to the management of severe cases. Again, these patients require oxygen therapy with a target of SpO2 again between 92 to 96%. Apart from oxygen therapy, these patients, they also require respiratory support, and this can be given as per the clinical status depending on whether the patient requires high flow nasal cannula or non-invasive ventilation. The trial of high flow nasal cannula and non-invasive ventilation should be given before invasive ventilation, and after ventilation, invasive ventilation, these should be managed as per the conventional ARDS protocol. Again, awake proning should be advised in all the patients. But remember, as the patients, they become more hypoxic, it is difficult to lie in the prone position for longer hours. So it is better to make them realize that they should do awake proning in the initial stages only. Maintain euvolemia. Yes, in the severe patients, they have bad lungs, and so we have to ought to the conservative fluid management, and you should not overload the patient if there is no evidence of shock. In the therapeutic drugs which we need to give, again we have to give anticoagulation, but now in the therapeutic dose, that is enoxaparin, we have to give in the BD dose right now in the patients who have severe cases. And the dose of anti-inflammatory is also almost double the dose as we give in the moderate cases. These steroids, they need to be continued for 5 to 10 days as per the clinical response. Now we talk about the monitoring of the patients in the severe cases. It is again essentially the same monitoring as in the moderate cases, except it is more intensive and more invasive. Here we now need continuous ECG monitoring, repeated ABGs, echo if required, and ultrasound chest. But HRCT should be done only if there is worsening. We should remember that it is very difficult to transport the patient who are on high flow nasal cannula or on non-invasive ventilation for CT scan. So we should not be asking for CT, and we should rely mainly on the clinical judgment and the serial chest X-rays. Apart from these drugs, the other drug which is used in moderate to severe case is the antivirals, that is remdesivir. The remdesivir has been given emergency use authorization, and it should be considered in patients who have moderate to severe disease, who land up within 10 days of onset of symptoms, and who do not have contraindications like renal dysfunction or hepatic dysfunction. So it has to be given only in select group of patients who come within 10 days of onset of symptoms. Remdesivir should be avoided in patients who are pregnant or lactating females, not to be given in children less than 12 years of age, and if there is any reaction, if there is any history of hypersensitivity to remdesivir or any other component of the formulation. It should not be given in patients who do not require oxygen. So that has to be kept in mind. The dose of remdesivir is first IV bolus dose of 200 mg is given on day 1, which is followed by 100 mg OD for next 5 days. The drug has to be given over 30 to 120 minutes duration, and normally it is given for 5 days, but it can be extended up to 10 days if there is no substantial improvement by day 5. There are various side effects we have seen with remdesivir. There can be severe bradycardia and hypertension. The heart rate can go down up to the tune of 40 with the remdesivir, so we have to be careful. There can be deranged LFTs and also minor side effects like skin rash, nausea, and hypersensitivity reactions. Although it has been prescribed, it should be prescribed only in a select group of patients, but over the time, remdesivir has been used rampantly. So to stop that, the Government of India has issued an advisory for the rational use of remdesivir for COVID-19 patients, which states that it is a reserve drug which is approved only under emergency use authorization, should be given only in select group of patients, not indicated in mild COVID-19 patients, must be advised by senior faculty members or specialists, must not be given by junior residents. Every hospital needs to set up a special drug committee which must review the use of remdesivir, and it should be procured and provided by the hospitals only. we should not be telling the attendants to procure the medicine. So this is an important advisory which has been issued just few days back to stop the irrational use of remdesivir. When we talk of other antivirals, there are other antivirals which have been in use initially since the onset of pandemic, but according to the latest guidelines, they don't have much use in moderate to severe cases. Favipiravir, it is an antiviral drug which is used to treat influenza. It was in use initially since the start of pandemic, but various studies and data has shown us that it has no effect on mortality or on disease severity. So it is not indicated in COVID-19 patients. Another important drug, lopinavir, ritonavir, which was started initially, again, it has no role in COVID-19 patients and should not be given. The guidelines recommend against the use of these two drugs. Another drug which has antiviral properties is ivermectin. It is an antihelminthic drug but has antiviral properties. It may be given in mild COVID-19 patients, and the doses, but no use in moderate to severe patients. The dose is 200 mics per kg once a day for 3 days. No dose adjustment is required in patients who have renal or hepatic impairment. The patients who are pregnant or lactating females, ivermectin should not be given in those patients. It has again mild side effects like pruritus, rash, tachycardia, edema, and diarrhea, and may also cause derangement in LFTs. Besides that, there has been lots of controversy about use of convalescent plasma. Convalescent plasma contains antibodies to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and these may help suppress the virus and modify the inflammatory response. Initial case series and retrospective studies, they showed promising results. However, data after that, including several RCTs, did not show the efficacy of convalescent plasma for hospitalized patients with COVID-19. Presently, it is not indicated and it is not in the guidelines. However, all these RCTs, they had certain limitations. So the jury is still not out. Adequately powered, well-designed studies are required to provide evidence-based guidance on the role of convalescent plasma in hospitalized patients. But as per now, we are not giving convalescent plasma. Another important group of drugs is the immunomodulators. Now, these immunomodulators, the most of them are either the anti-IL-6 drugs or the JAK inhibitors which have been studied. Now, anti-IL-6 drugs, these are the drugs which block the anti-IL-6 receptors like tocilizumab, or anti-IL-6 itself like cetuximab. Then there are drugs which stop the action of various cytokines like baricitinib. So it is a genus activated kinase inhibitors which stop the signaling by the various cytokines, leading to immune suppression. So these drugs have been studied in COVID-19 patients. The most important of which is the tocilizumab. It is a recombinant humanized monoclonal antibody that inhibits the binding of IL-6 to IL-6 receptors. Now, this drug, it should be considered in select group of patients when they meet all of the criteria below. So that is to be remembered. Again, tocilizumab is indicated in only a select group of patients who have all the criteria in them. That is the presence of severe disease and the patients who have rapidly deteriorating oxygen status. That is the patient who was on non-breathing mask in the morning and by evening he is on HFNC or requiring NIV. These are the patients in whom we should consider tocilizumab. Preferably within 24 to 48 hours of the onset of severe disease or ICU admission. It should not be given later in the course of ICU admission. Patients who have significantly raised inflammatory markers, that is CRP or IL-6, they are not improving despite the use of adequate dose of steroids, and the patients who have no active bacterial, fungal or tubercular infection. So when all these criteria are present in one patient, we can give tocilizumab. The recommended dose is 4 to 6 mg per kg, that is 400 mg in 60 kg adult, which is to be given in a normal saline over 1 hour. Again, as it is an immunosuppressant, it has certain side effects, which are, it can lead to deranged LFTs and late onset secondary infection. This is a very important side effect which we need to reconsider. The patients on tocilizumab may develop secondary infections later on. Cases of severe and disseminated strongyloidosis have been reported with the use of tocilizumab and corticosteroids in patients with COVID-19. And whenever we are prescribing this drug, again highlighting, again telling that we have to rule out the contraindications. Another important drug which is raising interest these days is baricitinib, that is the Janus activated kinase inhibitors. Again, these drugs, they block the signaling via numerous cytokines, which include IL-2, IL-6 and IL-12 and interferons. It is still not in the guidelines, so not to be used in moderate to severe cases. But yes, in the rare circumstances when corticosteroids cannot be used, baricitinib along with remdesivir can be used. This is with the limited evidence only. But however, there is upcoming evidence which suggests survival benefit in the hospitalized patients in the COVE barrier phase 3 trials, which has been published. So according to this, baricitinib may have some role, but again, it needs to be seen further. The dose is 4 milligrams OD for 14 days. Again, it is an immunosuppressant, so it can lead to complications like severe immunosuppression, cytopenias, and thromboembolic events. We have seen thromboembolic events with the use of baricitinib and abnormal LFTs. Besides that, there is a lot of interest being generated in other class of drugs, that is the anti-SARS-CoV-2 monoclonal antibodies. These antibodies, they target the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein and block the entry of the virus into the cells. There has been trials worldwide about these monoclonal antibodies. The phase 3 trial of REGEN-COV, that is the combination of two monoclonal antibodies, casirivimab and imdivimab combination, it showed promising result by reducing the chance of hospitalization by 70% in patients with mild to moderate disease, and also reducing the time to resolution of symptoms by 4 days. However, it is not still in the guidelines. Whether these monoclonal antibodies are effective against the emerging strain in India is debatable. We are not sure. The studies are not done in India. So we should not be using them. It should not be used offhand in patients with the moderate to severe disease. However, if we get data, the possible indications can be non-hospitalized patients with mild to moderate disease who are at risk of clinical progression. It should not be used in patients who are already admitted, but the patients who are non-hospitalized but who are at high risk of clinical progression, and they should be given as soon as possible after the patient receives a positive result or within the 10 days of symptom onset. The dose is 1200 milligrams, which consists of 2 antibodies. Either can be given intravenously or subcutaneously. The side effects, they are mainly related to infusion, that is the infusion-related reactions, which are seen in less than 0.3% of the patients. So this is all about the study about these antibodies. But again, whether we can give an Indian population, what will be the effect of these monoclonal antibodies in Indian population is yet to be seen. Another drug which has come up just in the previous past is a anti-COVID drug developed by DRDO, that is the 2DG, that is 2-deoxy-D-glucose. It is essentially a modified glucose which halts viral replication. Again, it has been given emergency use authorization in May only, but still it is not in the guidelines. It should not be used rampantly. Although DRDO has recommended its use to be given in moderate to severe COVID patients, claims are that it causes faster recovery in COVID patients who are hospitalized. DRDO has presented the phase 3 data to DGCI, but however, there is no published data till date in the scientific community. So again, we should not be going by these data. We should wait for more data which is published. It is available in sachet form and has to be taken BD by dissolving it in water for a week. So these are the all drugs I wanted to discuss which are there for the treatment of COVID-19. To conclude, I would like to say that there are many pharmacotherapy options available for the management of COVID-19 patients. However, not all are indicated in all the patients. Right drug at the right time in right dosage is the key to success. We need to see which category of patients require which drug. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richa Agarwal, for a very comprehensive presentation on medical management and covering all the latest issues as far as steroids, antiviral, monoclonal antibodies, and anti-IL-6 therapies, and also touching upon newer drugs like baricitinib and 2-DG and their role currently based on whatever the available literature is. So this is something where there is bound to be a lot of discussion as to the utility of many of these molecules and when they should they be used and when should they not be used in a given criteria. So before I ask Rajiv to take the questions and ask the panelists, from those people who are part of the panel, if you have any suggestions or any questions, just raise your hand and we can have your suggestions right now or as we go along with the questions. So just raise your hand and I'm sure I or Rajiv will then be able to take your comments or questions if you have any of them. Otherwise, I'll ask Rajiv to really moderate the session with the questions which have already come on to the chat box or the Q&A.
We have a number of questions that have come in onto the chat box, so we'll start with those. The first one is on anticoagulation. And should everybody get anticoagulation, or is there criteria for who should get it and who should not? And we're talking only about patients who are now in hospital. We're not talking of home isolation anymore. So it's either patients with moderate or severe disease. So everybody, or are there parameters which can tell you that we should give anticoagulation to these patients?
So I think Dr. Richa Agarwal did touch upon that, and I'll just add on to that because this becomes another question. What should be the dose? Because you have some studies which say you should only give prophylactic dose. Some say that you can give a semi-therapeutic dose, and some go on to saying that you give a therapeutic dose. And there is also data which suggests that even if you give a therapeutic dose, there are some individuals who will continue to still have a hypercoagulable state and have strokes and other manifestation. So probably Richa and then maybe Anjan can give his comments as far as anticoagulants are concerned.
Yes, sir. So in the moderate cases, the guidelines say that we should start with the prophylactic dose of the anticoagulants. That is in the moderate cases. Whereas in severe cases, we should give therapeutic dose of the anticoagulants. It should be started in all the patients, and we can then evaluate by seeing the D-dimers repeatedly.
Okay.
I think Rich has put it correctly. All the trials which have been done, Active 4A trial, REMAP trial, CAP trials, they have all shown us that if they are given in the moderate COVID disease, the outcomes are surely better, the prophylactic dose. The moment the patient becomes severe, you tend to go to therapeutic doses. And as Professor Guleria has rightly said, in spite of all these therapeutic doses, which would be a BD dose of low molecular weight heparin, you would have some patients who would land up into thrombotic events. We've also seen that happening, but we've not really gone beyond that. And we have very rare cases where we've given unfractionated heparin infusions, where you have to monitor it a bit more religiously to see that the bleeding parameters are within normal limits. So heparins are a big yes, prophylactic and therapeutic, moderate and severe cases. And still you will have, once in a while, you will have a patient who would have a thrombotic event. But for that, you will have to be on a lookout and then treat them accordingly. Yes.
So I agree with that. I would just like to add that, although there are certain guidelines, if you go through the literature, there are certain international guidelines which tend to focus more on a semi-therapeutic dose rather than a full therapeutic dose.
by and large, most of clinicians would actually move from prophylactic dose to a therapeutic dose if the patient worsens and becomes more severe. So I think you could argue that some guidelines don't really recommend that much of a therapeutic dose and would go on a semi-therapeutic dose, but most of us are giving a therapeutic dose knowing that many of our patients still go on to have a thrombotic event.
Thank you, sir. So we'll move on to the next one. We'll probably come back to anticoagulation at some point later in the day. I don't see that about the first few questions. The next is on high flow oxygen therapy. So how many days would you give a trial of high flow nasal cannula before you decide you want to move on to the next type of therapy? Although I expect this will be covered by me tomorrow as well, or maybe you could take it since we have a question higher.
So the issue here, which I think Anjan would be able to answer, and maybe then I can ask Manish also, or if Anant is there. Basically, two questions really emerge. One is, which is better, high flow nasal cannula or non-invasive ventilation? And when should you choose one or the other? And when should you switch from one to the other? This is a common question when most people ask that if I have a person who's deteriorating, should I straight away start NIV or should I go to high flow nasal oxygen? And then when do I switch from one to the other, or is one better than the other?
Yes, I think during the last wave also when we had these EICUs, this was one of the most commonly asked query, NIV versus high flow nasal cannulas. The question here, what Rajiv put forward was that one should try it for how many days. First, I'll try to answer that. See, there is no endpoint or there are no number of days which have been allowed as per any study where you could use it for 2 days or 3 days or half a day or a couple of hours. What you tend to do is that if a patient is on high flow nasal cannula and the patient is doing well and he doesn't show any other side effects of high flow nasal cannula in the form of when you give high flows, you have barotraumas, you can use it for a reasonably good time as long as your ABG is okay and your oxygenation is maintained. It is all being done because we all know that once you try to intubate these patients, then the category of morbidity and mortality changes and these patients would now be into a critical care. Critical phase where outcomes could be different. So what we do here is that the patient who goes on a high flow nasal cannula, then he's monitored regularly. They are more than happy to be lying prone with that, and that's an advantage. They can have their sips of water or eat or drink something, whatever they can when the high flow nasal cannula is in place. So compliance is better. So we are very comfortable using that. But after having said that, one needs to be very careful that one doesn't start from a high flow rate. Try to keep the lowest possible flow rate which is available, for which you can maintain a level of oxygen, let's say about 30 to 40 liters, and a FiO2 of 0.5 to 0.6, and then if you are doing it, it's fine. Now the controversy or the question between NIV and a high flow nasal cannula. See, if the patient tends to retain carbon dioxide, it has been seen that NIV will be working better, and there are various interfaces available. But the problem with the NIV would be that the patient would have a tight hissing mask. He could be claustrophobic. In our group of patients, we've tried our helmets and they don't really do well. If you have a nasal CPAP mask or NIV mask, they don't keep the mouth closed. So one has to really juggle around with NIV and high flow nasal cannulas. But NIVs are supposed to be doing better when we have high CO2 levels. And then you can have a EPAP and an IPAP and you can play around with these two pressures. Many times in our patients, we've tried to, if a patient is doing well on a high flow nasal cannula or if a patient is doing well on NIVs, then you can really alternate them for a couple of hours, and a few patients have done after that also. An important thing with an NIV is they tend to, develop some ischemia around the nose because it's a tight fitting mask and they develop ulcers. So one must take care of all those things when you keep NIVs for a longer time. There are NIV interfaces masks which have holes in it through which a rice tube can come out, or you can put in straws to drink water, but they have really not worked in our setup. Maybe somebody else has to add something.
Okay, if any addition that you would like to give, I'd just like to add one thing, that as far as duration is concerned, there's really no duration. As Anjan said, you will continue to give non-invasive ventilation till the patient actually improves. And we had one patient who actually was on high flow nasal oxygen for 3 months. He went on to post-COVID, he got ICU psychosis. Then I shifted him to the private ward on a high flow nasal oxygen. He was in our new private ward for quite some time. And then with pulmonary rehabilitation, he came off the high flow nasal cannula and went home on a very low flow oxygen. He did well. Unfortunately, this was during the first wave. He got COVID again during the second wave, but had a mild illness and continues to be on low flow oxygen with pulmonary rehabilitation. So there's no limit as to when, for how long you can give it. You need to give it for as long as the patient needs it. And if you can get away without intubating, then that is your basic aim. So I think that is what one should really consider. But as Anjan said, the issue of is NIV better than high flow nasal cannula, I think it depends. It has to be individualized and see what type of interface the patient is more comfortable with. Any comment from?
So can I answer? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Manisha, yes, and then Dr. Anant Mohan.
So yes, patient comfort is definitely a factor. HFNC patients are much more comfortable. And one understanding that we developed during the course of pandemic, HFNC is something which we can use very comfortably in the ward setting. So obviously, when the work of breathing is increased or CO2 is being retained, one has to go for NIV and further on. But short of it, if the patients are started on HFNC, they can be easily managed in the ward. 1, 2, the success rate for HFNC is very high. So these two are very good points which promotes the use of HFNC, though then again they have this issue of high oxygen requirement use when HFNC is being used. So all those things came in. But HFNC as such is very useful, started in time.
Anand, you wanted to say something? We can't hear you.
One just point to add to that, when we compare NIV with HFNC, is the risk of pneumothorax. One thing depends upon is what we have available. One, if we have both, then are we adequately kind of trained to use both? And if we are, then we have to come to the side effect or toxicity. So NIV, we have seen quite a bit of pneumothorax this time. I don't know, somehow. And many of them were on NIV, some were actually on HFNC also. So I'm not saying that there can be no pneumothorax which HFNC, it can be. So uncontrolled flow rates, uncontrolled pressures should not be there. One will have to be very careful when using either of these two. Please be very careful when you are kind of looking at the flow rates. With NIV, the chances of pneumothorax definitely are probably higher, and that is to be taken into account.
Right, thanks. So we have a couple of questions now on remdesivir, and this is something which we see every time we do these. I'll take some of them one by one. The first is, what is the maximum duration that you can give for remdesivir? Is it always 5 days? Can you go beyond 5 days? How long can you give it?
So I think Richa again touched upon that. Maybe Neeraj can also try and answer that. And
so again, regarding remdesivir, the question is still there whether it has got any role whatsoever. So again, there is a group of patients with early oxygen requirement where it may have some role. Now we have to understand that starting remdesivir too early is not going to actually help in any way. The reason may be just because that remdesivir has a very weak antiviral in vivo inside our body. So maybe when the viral load is very high, it's not going to do much, make much difference. But at the time when the body, when the patient starts requiring low flow oxygen, that is the time when viral load is slightly on lower side and immune response has started mounting, which may go out of control. So when viral load is slightly lower, maybe this remdesivir may have some role by suppressing that limited viral load and preventing further initiation of the cytokine response against these viruses. So the duration, I don't think it should be prolonged more than 5 days in most of the cases. And in fact, the CDC always say if patient has improved, oxygen requirement is fine, and you are planning to discharge the patient, you can even terminate, you don't have to give it for 5 days even, depending on the situation of the patient. So extending this antiviral drug beyond 5 days, especially when patient is very sick and we are anticipating that this is because of the cytokine response, the cytokine release syndrome, then I don't think there's any point in prolonging and the duration of the use of this remdesivir. So ideally 5 days, but if you want, you can extend, but we usually don't extend unless indicated for some other reason.
I think you've actually answered another question that was brought up as to can we stop it in less than 5 days. So you're quite clear that yes, if the patient has improved, you can actually stop it at less than 5 days. So that was the other question which was up on the panel. Again, continuing with remdesivir and pregnancy and lactation, is there enough data now to say that it is safe, or does it continue to be contraindicated?
Okay, this is also an important question, that what are the risk benefit and how should you give it? I see Saurabh is also there, so maybe I can ask Saurabh if he can answer that question.
So, sir, remdesivir as of now for pregnancy, it is not recommended to use remdesivir routinely for pregnant patients, as far as my understanding is concerned regarding the use of remdesivir.
Yes, as far as the guidelines are concerned, it is not really recommended for pregnant patients. What it really says is that in a given situation, you may take a risk-benefit analysis, and if you really feel it's useful, then you may take the consent and then give it. But as Neeraj mentioned, the data for the utility of remdesivir is not that strong, and that is why you have to be very careful if you want to give a drug which has actually not shown to have a mortality benefit, and the safety data is not that strong. Anyone from the panelists would like to add on to this and their experience with remdesivir as far as pregnancy is concerned?
Sir, another point I would like to make regarding the duration. So probably for patients who have been immunosuppression before the onset of COVID, for such patients, if the fever persists beyond, then probably that's only a situation where remdesivir may be used beyond 5 days to maximum of 10 days, but not routinely.
Okay, Anjan wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think what I wanted to say, he said it. There would be a small group of patients where we also have used it for 10 days. And Saurabh has said it, what I wanted to. And then even in patients, in participants who are breastfeeding, we'll try to avoid. Even in lactation, there is, as per the standard guidelines, as per today, one should try to avoid it.
I'm going to continue with questions on pregnancy and lactation. And again, the question is, which drugs are safe in pregnancy and lactation for COVID in moderate and severe cases?
Okay, so the main drug that we give, steroids, are safe. I can say that. Richard, do you want to answer that question?
So yes, steroids, they are safe. We can use either of the methylprednisolone or dexamethasone. When the patient needs steroids for the maturity of the baby, then we usually give dexamethasone. Otherwise, we can give methylprednisolone. And this is the only drug which has shown the mortality benefit till now in COVID-19. So we continue with this drug in moderate to severe patients.
Okay, thanks. The next few questions I'll put together are all on anticoagulation. We'll take all of them one by one. So you already answered the choice between prophylactic and therapeutic. The next question was the newer oral anticoagulant agents. Can we use those, or should we stick to the standard heparin and Clexane and stuff?
So maybe I can just add on to that question. One is the role of the newer anticoagulants or the direct oral anticoagulants during COVID, and what is the role once a person is recovered and you're sending him home? Is there a role of putting a person on oral anticoagulants because let me put it this way, his D-dimer is elevated? So let me ask Dr. Anant Mohan, and then I'll ask the other panelists what their opinion is as far as this is concerned.
Anticoagulation, again, most of the things here are not evidence-based, they are mostly practice-based. But as far as the use of anticoagulation is concerned, it is recommended to be done in hospital setting only as far as the prophylactic dose is concerned, or even the injectable therapeutic dose is concerned. As long as the person is hospitalized and he fits into the criteria for anticoagulation, whether oral, whether therapeutic or prophylactic, that has to be continued. As of now, there is no standard recommendation for continuing anticoagulation, especially prophylactic anticoagulation, once a person leaves the hospital and is discharged. If therapeutic anticoagulation is given, then it has to be given, and it is given for a documented thrombus. Then that may be continued once, once we decide to repeat the, say, Doppler or whatever is the site of the thrombus after a couple of weeks. Again, I'm not aware of any standard cutoff point for how long that has to be given. And so that is probably what we practice. The D-dimer, the question on D-dimer is also there. It is a surrogate marker of prothrombotic state, although it is not a very strong marker, but it has to be used along with all the other clinical criteria. So we should not target to normalize the D-dimer always with anticoagulation. So that is not, I mean, we are not treating the D-dimer always. Again, if patient is otherwise well, he is mobile and he is not at risk for any thrombotic states, even though his D-dimer may be slightly elevated, but if it is coming in a downward trend, one may stop the anticoagulation and monitor D-dimer subsequently.
Okay, any other comments from the panelists? Any suggestions? Because this is a issue which comes up very frequently, especially in the private sector, that many patients are discharged on the direct oral anticoagulants and they continue for a long period of time. All of these drugs are double-edged swords. So sometimes you may actually cause more harm than good, and therefore you should be very clear in terms of when to give them, especially once the patient is discharged. Anjan wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think, sir, you rightly said, and the only cases where we try to use anticoagulants per se after they're going to be discharged is if the patient was on an anticoagulant because of a comorbid condition before he really came with COVID, was, let's say, a mitral valve replacement or something of that kind. And a small subgroup could be patients who are more liable to go into a DVT kind of a picture because of basic disease, fat, obese, malignancy or something of that kind, who would be bedridden in their houses. Other than that, there is no indication of giving anticoagulants, oral 10A, the new ones, or even warfarin sodium, or even Dispin for that matter. A lot of people are discharged from various places all over our country on aspirin 75 to 150 milligrams. There is no data to tell us whether they are useful or not, and the same is true for oral 10A anticoagulants, the newer ones which are there, and for how long if the question doesn't arise. So it's as long as the patient doesn't need it, and that's a very small subgroup.
Right, sir. So the next question now is on antifibrinolytics. Should we be giving, or actually antifibrotics, not antifibrinolytics, antifibrotics? Should we be giving antifibrotics to these patients?
This is again a very sort of burning question, if I put it that way. And not only should we give it, when should we give it? Some pulmonologists argue that you should give it early because their action will start early and you will decrease fibrosis. There are a large number of trials which are already going on, looking at both pirfenidone and nintedanib. Currently, it's important to understand that the type of fibrosis that occurs in interstitial lung disease, whether it be CTD related or IPF, is different from the type of fibrosis we see in a post-infective stage, which is usually not progressive and will heal with time. And there is data even from the SARS outbreak of CT scans and people who had deterioration in the lung function, who improved gradually over many months or years without any antifibrotics. So there is still a lot of debate, but I'll throw it open to the panelists to really give their opinion, and I'll start with Dr. Anant Mohan and then have Manish's comments on the role of antifibrotics in post-COVID situation, when and whether to give or not, and if to give, when should we give?
Sir, I think the basic question remains that the primary disease itself has a bit of fibrotic sequelae, which is most of the time liable to heal on its own over a period of time. It doesn't most of the time, so we should give 2 to 3 months. That is what. Again, nothing of this is evidence-based, and there are always these two schools of thought. What we do follow is that when after a significant COVID pneumonia, we follow the patient symptomatically also, and also not always radiologically. But if the symptoms are improving, and we also do spirometry or other measures like 6-minute walk test, desaturation, if that is fine, then really there is no need to start antifibrotics so early. Now, the other school of thought says that what is the harm in giving antifibrotics early, because it may be as a prophylactic measure, better start early rather than late. Why do you want to wait till the time fibrosis develops? But most often than not, we have seen a large number of patients up to several months after COVID, the occurrence of say actual ILD after 3 to 4 months is very low. So most of the time it heals, and that is why it becomes a little difficult to justify giving antifibrotics early to all patients with pneumonia who are getting recovered. That becomes probably a little bit of an overkill. Again, these are all practice based. There is no evidence based to this. So again, I'll seek the opinion of my other colleagues as well. But this is what we do.
Right.
So,
sorry, yeah, go ahead, Manish.
Yeah, so a very large majority of patients whom we followed up after the first wave, even though they had residual findings on chest extra CT scan at the time of discharge, when we followed them till 3 months, most of them had disappeared. Clinically, obviously, they had improved. There's another phenotype of patients who are having rapidly progressive fibrotic changes. So that is a very small subgroup, and those mostly are those who stay very prolonged hospital admission with respiratory supportive measures. So the question is in that group, I think more whether it will be useful or not. Again, the trials are ongoing, we will come to know. But in vast majority of patients who are discharged, even on low flow oxygen, they are given a gradual taper of steroid over a few weeks, and nearly all of them have recovered over 3 months, and all the changes have really regressed on the chest X-ray or CT scan. So I would say it not really that much to be used.
So I think if I may just sort of sum up, I think we need more evidence before we say they're of much use. There really are not enough evidence to say, because we can't extrapolate the data that we have from, let's say, scleroderma associated ILD or IPF, because those are different pathophysiology as compared to the post-infective changes that we see, and they will resolve on their own. So many times people claim that I gave pirfenidone and there was an improvement in the patient. That improvement would have occurred even if you did not give the drug. So that is why you need to have good trials to really prove it one way or the other. Currently, the evidence is not strong enough to say that you should put all patients who you discharge with some changes on the CT scan on antifibrotics.
Right, so the next couple of questions now are on steroids. So the first is it essential to start steroid therapy when you start oxygen, or the other way around, if you started oxygen, should you be starting, so do they go hand in hand?
So maybe I can ask Richa to answer that question.
Yes, so the indication of steroids is very clear. As the patients require oxygen, we should start steroids. We can give either of them methylprednisolone or dexamethasone. Yes, because now the patient is going from the pulmonary phase to the hyperinflammatory phase, and steroids are the only anti-inflammatory drugs. We have to stop the inflammation in the beginning only. So we need to start on steroids.
Okay, so I'll just extend that a little bit. And that question is basically to the panelists, is that suppose you have an individual who is maintaining his oxygen saturation, because hypoxemia is a surrogate marker of progression of disease in leading to lung involvement. But we know that COVID-19 can have a lot of extra pulmonary involvement. It can dominantly involve the lung. So if you have a person who on the 7th or let's say 7th to 10th day continues to have high grade fever, but his saturation is maintained and he has other symptoms, would you then consider giving steroids in such a case, even if the person is not hypoxemic? Because the recovery trial look at those who are admitted with and required oxygen, but indirectly it was basically a surrogate marker of an inflammatory response going on in the second phase of the illness, when you had the viral load coming down and the inflammatory response going up. So I'm going to ask this question to, maybe I'll ask Neeraj what his comments are, or what his thoughts are regarding such a situation. No hypoxemia, fever persisting on the 8th day. Do you think steroids should be given?
So during this particular wave, we have come across a lot of patients. Now, counting the day of fever is something which can be problematic. When actually the infection started, whether this type, the fever day which we are counting is actually from the day of infection, or just because somebody developed fever in the second half of the disease, that is the second week of disease. We are never sure about that. So if a patient who has persistent fever beyond 7-8 days, overall picture, sometimes we have to rely on the imaging in such patients. Okay, this patient is not improving, has high risk of developing complication in the term of whether the age is more, the patient may have comorbidities. In such patients, we tend to rely on radiological findings and the inflammatory markers. Basically, CRP is one of the markers on which we relied in such situation where fever persisted. And based on the clinical lab and the radiological findings, sometimes we did start these patients on steroid even when their oxygen saturation was almost normal. But invariably, if we look closely in these patients, then the range of the oxygen saturation starts shifting towards the lower range. So if somebody who had saturation of 95 to 98 initially will have saturation somewhere between 92 to 96 in most of these cases. So if we look closely, we will get an indication that okay, these patients are actually progressing further and they require intervention. As Dr. Richa said, right drug at right time. So this right time is still a matter of debate whether we should wait till the patient start requiring oxygen, or can we slightly prepone that treatment so that that requirement does not start. But again, it's a very fine line. We cannot start too early because that can cause further problem, and we cannot wait too late when we can't do anything. So still a clinical judgment call has to be taken whether we can give treatment, start steroid at the start slightly earlier than what recovery trial has basically shown us. And in some patients we have used and we have successfully used in that, but not all patients will require like that.
Right. So continuing on the steroid questions, although you did mention it, Richard, that you can use either methylprednisolone or Dexa, this question is very specific that is there a specific reason to choose one steroid over the other, and also the route of administration? So would you choose whatever is available, or is there a specific choice?
Okay, that also comes up very frequently. Manish, would you like to say dexamethasone versus methylprednisolone versus prednisolone?
So actually both of them can be used, though the recovery used dexamethasone, so it became commonplace that all guidelines are mentioned dexamethasone, most of the guidelines, but there are other studies as well with methylprednisolone and with the previous experience that was with ARDS previously. So methylprednisolone is equally good and both of them can be used. And when the patient is sick, moderate severe category, intravenous route will obviously be preferable. To compare to someone who is, say, moderate disease with a very low oxygen flow requirement, 2 to 3 liters, their oral preparations may be used, but otherwise intravenous preparations would be preferred.
So if I may just add one more thing, sorry Rajiv, which again people bring up, is if you have a person who has got moderate to severe illness, what should be the dose of steroids, and is there an advantage of giving a higher dose steroids, and especially let's say pulse methylprednisolone over say 1 to 2 milligram per kg of methylprednisolone in such a situation? So Manish, your comments, and then I'll ask Dr. Anand for his comments.
As recommended in guidelines, it has to be low dose steroids, 0.5 to 1 mg for moderate disease, and someone with a severe disease on ventilator, we see is worsening, we can go maximum 1 to 2 mg per kg. High dose steroids, pulse steroids, though it has been used a lot, not only during this pandemic, has been used previously in ARDS as well, but they have never shown to have benefit. In fact, they have been shown to have a harmful effect in terms of increased risk of secondary infections. And infections are much more common in our setting compared to the Western settings. So we have to be very careful with the secondary infections. And so giving a high dose pulse steroid, I would say there is evidence to use it for COVID.
Anand, anything you want to add?
So at this point of time, the high dose pulse steroid has not really been evaluated properly. So we stick to the guidelines which are there. There was one small publication which looked at pulse methylprednisolone and its efficacy on the clinical outcomes. I think just a small trial of 32 patients in the intervention and same on the control arm. Again, the results were not very great in favor of pulse. Only in one secondary endpoint, they found that pulse steroid had a benefit. I think it was time to clinical recovery or something like that, but there were no improvement in as far as the hard clinical outcomes were concerned, like mortality benefit or other outcomes. So as of now, again, probably we cannot say with certainty that it is definitely superior. Again, one will have to individualize and take it depending upon the severity and the criticality of the case. But again, this will have to be done very carefully.
Right, sir. So the next question is how long? When do you know that it's time to take the steroids off?
So maybe Anjan, you could answer that. How long should we give steroids?
See, the standard practice is that you give steroids for 5 to 10 days and then try to stop it. And if you've given for 5 days, you need not taper it like what a normal practice is at times. One really doesn't need to go beyond 10 days because, as already mentioned, it will add to a lot of problems which are associated with steroids, especially in a hospital setting or an ICU setting in our setups. So steroids at the right time and at the right dose and for the right duration. That's what is important.
Right, sir. We've addressed the question of anticoagulation and D-dimer earlier, but there are still a number of questions which are coming up on it. So maybe we could just summarize it once again, and I'll ask those 2 or 3 questions which are specific. The first is the patient has elevated D-dimer but is being discharged. So should I send him home on anticoagulation? If I do, how frequently do I monitor the D-dimers, and what is the end point of stopping the oral anticoagulation? So we did address this, but maybe we can do it again because the questions keep coming up. So high D-dimer at discharge, how long do I continue the anticoagulation? When do I repeat the D-dimers, and what do I do based on what I get on the D-dimers?
So this question will keep coming up because this is something which, like I said, is commonly practiced, D-dimer has become something like your normal routine testing that you will do. Some testing which we would never do routinely, like CRP, D-dimer, ferritin, has now become sort of routine testing. D-dimer we used to do because of its negative predictive value. D-dimer can be elevated even if you have, let's say, a chest infection, or in large number of conditions you may have a high D-dimer. So it had a negative predictive value when you looked at pulmonary thromboembolism. It was never a positive value that a high D-dimer would say that you have a pulmonary embolism. There could be other causes. But I'll ask Manish to answer that question because this is something which you see very often, and this continues to create a controversy.
So D-dimer estimation has been done without indication even in mild patients who had home isolation. Then once that report comes, it starts. So what is the cutoff value beyond which we treat? We don't know. So even if it is in home isolation mild patients, or whether it is at the time of discharge. So in spite of so many studies, we do not know, we do not have sufficient data to say what is the optimum cutoff value beyond which we really need to intervene. The only point that we have to follow is clinical judgment. If the patient is not going to be mobile for whatever underlying conditions that the patient may be having, some recent surgery, some trauma, some fracture, whatever. If there is some underlying indication for which there may be a chance of increased thromboembolism, yes, anticoagulation needs to be given as per what we used to do prior to this pandemic. For COVID per se, otherwise healthy, mobile patient having a D-dimer value something higher than the upper limit, we don't know what is the upper limit, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. We really need not do anything, and what we have seen is all these markers do come down on follow-up, and we don't see much of a problem really, and we do not discharge patients on anticoagulation or aspirin, and on follow-up we have seen all these markers will come down and no events per se.
So I think it's important to understand that these are you must look at the clinical profile of the patient and not really chase lab values. The fear that actually drives all of this is this so-called case reports or cases that people hear on WhatsApp of sudden cardiac death happening at the time of discharge, and some people will say that this is because of a thrombotic event, and therefore maybe we should give low dose anticoagulants at discharge. I don't think there's any evidence to link that, and it's important to understand that because this is, I think, what is driving a lot of the oral anticoagulants at the time of discharge. Before I ask Rajiv to go on to the next question, any suggestions or comments from any other members on the panel who are there? If you have anything to suggest or any questions, just raise your hand. It would be great to have your inputs also.
Can I add something?
Yes, sir.
Can I?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Right. It's a very interesting observation, and I think all of us sitting here would have faced it once in a while. A lot of patients tend to ask us, being in a tertiary care hospital, after they are discharged from another corporate or private hospital or general hospital, that this is my D-dimer, I've been discharged on an oral anticoagulant, what should I do? So if we take a consensus, do you try to stop it because we strongly feel it is not required, or you tell him to continue and then see it after 10 days? It's a very catch-22 situation that somebody has prescribed it. Are we totally justified to stop it?
Anjan, I didn't hear your last part.
Okay, sir, I just wanted to put across that all of us have come across prescriptions from corporate or private hospitals or government hospitals where because of D-dimers, these oral anticoagulants of whatever nature have been prescribed, and the patients are discharged on that. And like a typical, which is a practice in our country, we tend to get a second opinion, and somebody comes to us and then we strongly feel this drug should not have been given. Should we try to stop it or just continue it for 7-10 days and then let it go?
So invariably, I would tell them to stop it, but you have to look at the whole situation in totality. I can't say that this will work for everyone. Some patients, despite you telling them to stop it, will continue to take the medication.
So I think the consensus is that we should let it be.
I'm not saying that. I would say that you should try and stop it, but often patients will not stop it even if you tell them to stop it. But you should ask them to stop it. Because like I said, these are double-edged swords. You may have a patient who may have intracerebral bleed because of taking too much of anticoagulants when it's not required. So we must really understand that, especially this may be true in the older age group. The elderly patients may have a bleed which may happen because of over-medication when it was not required.
Yes, sir. I was trying to get this across the panel and the discussion is that a lot of patients are being discharged on a fistful of medications, and especially the oral age group people, they tend to, duplicate their medications. It's always worthwhile not to discharge patients on vitamin C, zincs, and all those things, and also anticoagulant. They tend to take it twice or double the dose and then let them into problem. It should be whatever is as per the literature, only that should be followed.
Surprising, we don't at the moment have a post-COVID polypill which has those 6 things all in it. It should be on the market soon enough. All right, the next question now, again, this is something we've been hearing for the last year and a half, and it's good to repeat it again. Methylene blue. Role of methylene blue in moderate and severe COVID.
So this is another important issue. Both people have even given nebulized methylene blue, if I may add that. And there has been, I remember in the early days when we used to hold our EICU, some doctors actually swore by methylene blue and said it really helps as far as hypoxemia is concerned and it will help. There's no evidence, but maybe I can ask the panelist, Neeraj, your comments on methylene blue.
So we have never recommended methylene blue because there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that this actually kills this virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus in nasal cavity or our oral cavity or pharynx. So at the moment, there is no evidence whatsoever. In fact, it can do more harm if given to patients. So at the moment, we don't recommend methylene blue, and this should not be used.
Okay.
Something?
Yeah, please.
Methylene blue has been used for vasoplastic septic shock, and we have in our ICUs pre-COVID used in a couple of patients, but our results are not very good. In the last surge, the first surge, there were people from Maharashtra, Gujarat, that belt who used to, as mentioned, swear by methylene blue in all possible ways, but somehow that practice has died down. We've not seen a lot of people in this surge trying to use it. One must realize that methylene blue itself is a myocardial depressant. We've had issues, we've had reported in the literature, especially in those patients where methylene blue was used, and earlier it was being used for during surgeries for CA breast, for mapping out lymph nodes, or for primary infertility to see the patency of the tubes. So we used to get once in a while, every 2 to 3 years, patients who used to have problems because of methylene blue. So methylene blue is not a very safe kind of a medication. We should not be using it, and there is no indication. It has again come into being a talk because people tended to put it in that oxygen, flow meter kind of a thing where they thought it could kill now the mucor fungus if they put methimbo in that. But there is no indication for that.
Right, sir. There are a couple of questions here on investigation. I'm just letting people know that investigations are going to be covered by Dr. Manish Taneja day after tomorrow. So questions on procalcitonin and CRP. So all this is going to be covered day after tomorrow. So we won't be taking those questions today. I'll take the next couple of questions which are on long COVID. And so what should be done to handle persistent weakness or mild shortness of breath after, say, about 4 weeks of COVID?
So I think a lot of issues will come up as far as post-COVID sequelae are concerned, both in the subacute and the stage and the long COVID or the features after 12 weeks, whether it be chronic fatigue syndrome, brain fog, organ damage, or a lot of other symptoms. So many of us are managing these patients. I'll ask Anand to give his views and then Manish also to add on to that. And if anyone else in the group would like to add on.
So that's correct that a large proportion of patients following recovery from the acute episode do continue to experience some or the other symptom for several weeks thereafter. Fortunately, most of these are relatively milder symptoms, which may be from persistent sore throat, dry cough, and especially the myalgia and the fatigue, which is the question here. Probably because sometimes it can be a hypercatabolic state. COVID, especially moderate to severe COVID, is a pretty hypercatabolic state. There may be muscle weaknesses, there may be sarcopenia. So all these things have been documented in subsequently. That may be one of the reasons. Of course, there's a post-inflammatory phase. The weakness and the myalgia is there. So the main thing is, one has to address these mostly in a more conservative manner. There is nothing very active that one can do about it. It has to be a mixture of boosting up your own body reserves, the boosting up your own diet, and doing a bit of graded exercises, getting back to your normal activities in a graded fashion. Again, not going too fast. So that is what we practice at our place also. Give them some good graded physiotherapy lessons, try to monitor them. Vitamins and all are being prescribed a lot. I'm not very sure how they will help. If a good balanced diet is there, high protein diet will help. For dyspnea, yes, we have to look for the cause. That is a kind of what you will call say organic symptom. So one has to see that there should not be something going on in the lungs. Pulmonary function test, other simple 6-minute walk test, breath holding time, etc. So these simple parameters, oxygenation, these will help us to determine whether that is more subjective or it is more pathological. And then appropriately using imaging at the right time, one can try and see. Inhaled bronchodilators or inhaled steroid also can be tried if chronic cough persists for a certain period of time. So that is what we are doing for this type.
Okay, Manish, anything you would like to add?
Yes, sir. So in the first pandemic that we saw, myalgia fatigue was a major complaint post-COVID. So around 25% of patients, 23% of patients had this complaint at the end of 1 month. And all sorts of things are being tried, multivitamins, carnitine, and etc. etc. But I think the cornerstone would remain a good, healthy, nutritious diet, pulmonary rehabilitation, and a graded increase in activity. And we see on follow-up of those patients, most of them have come out of those symptoms over a few months. So gradually all of them do improve, and it is going to be conservative only, nothing really aggressive there.
Yes, but I would just like to add that two things. One is that there has to be a multidisciplinary approach. It's not that it's going to involve only one organ. There can be multiple system involvement. And then sometimes there's a need for psychological support. So sometimes what we don't really focus a lot on is the mental health issues, whether it's depression, anxiety, panic attacks. So those are also something that we need to keep in mind rather than just looking at fatigue, body aches, cough, or the other symptoms. And therefore, the need for a post-COVID clinic in most hospitals is something which is important and should be developed, because the cases, the percentage-wise, they may not be large, but if you look at the absolute number of people who will have problems as part of post-COVID sequelae, they are still significant and they do need some degree of medical help, if I may put it that way.
So just to add on to that, sir, we were comparing the post-COVID sequelae in the two waves. In the last wave, the hearing disturbances and the taste disturbances were probably much more common. I think if we can think about that, this time probably they are not so common, even during the acute episode and even following that. But yes, the psychological problems this time is pretty marked, sir. And maybe last time we did not focus too much on them, but now we are seeing a lot of that brain fogging, loss of concentration. Insomnia is becoming very common, sir, and a little bit of depression and anxiety. So these things are pretty common. And I think this is the feedback that we have got from our psychiatry colleagues also, who are seeing a couple of patients in our place. They have also said there's a pretty high prevalence of these problems in this particular way.
Correct. So I think that is very true, and it's partly related to the fact that the second wave caused much more, let's say, anxiety, pain, and suffering than the first wave because of the sheer rapid rise in the number of cases. Also, it seems that the variant which caused the second wave, the Delta variant, probably causes less loss of sense of smell and the loss of taste that was seen in the Wuhan variant. So there seems to be a slight difference in the clinical profile also. That's also true.
Right. So continuing on the long COVID, another couple of questions. Is there any role of selective beta blockers, or is there any role of continuing aspirin for long COVID?
So I think those are important questions. There's one question on YouTube also. Is there a role of ivermectin in post-COVID sequelae? And also the reason why I think beta blockers has come in, because there are many patients as a post-COVID sequelae who continue to have tachycardia. You know, their pulse may continue to be 110, 120, and that persists for a long period of time. And then the argument is, should we give them some drugs to decrease their pulse rate? They're otherwise all right. There's no fever. Saturation is all right. But heart rate continues to be high. Echo is normal. And it's a sinus tachycardia. So again, suggestions from the group. I'll start with Neeraj. What is your opinion as far as what should be done in such a situation?
So again, one important aspect which sometimes we might overlook is the unmasking of the underlying problem a particular person may have, especially in females, where they might have a lower hemoglobin. Initially, they might not be realizing what problem they are facing. But once they have COVID-19, they experience what is this trouble in breathing or dyspnea is. And after that, they realize they are not feeling okay. So we have to keep into account whatever underlying problem they may have that needs to be addressed. And of course, anxiety is one of that component. So this tachycardia, especially in females, one has to rule out underlying anemia before considering any beta blocker because of tachycardia and all. And some patients may already be on thyroid medication, and sometimes what we have observed that the requirement of thyroid medication decreases after COVID-19. Some patients have this type of problem. So before starting any medication, we have to rule out if we are not missing something which may actually be precipitated by the medication we are going to give. So starting beta blocker in every patient with tachycardia is something which is not advisable. Most of these patients, their heart rate is either because of anemia, because of anxiety, and these settle over a time. It's not that all of them will continue to have tachycardia. So on an average, between 4 to 6 weeks, most of these patients, the tachycardia settles and they don't require any sort of treatment except for some psychological counseling and telling them that everything will be fine. So we have to have a pragmatic approach before starting any medication for all these long effects.
Right. So we don't have a session separately on vaccination, and there are a number of questions. So maybe we could just take a couple of them. We don't have too many questions on drugs anymore. So I'll just summarize them one after the other. Is there any rationale currently for choosing one vaccine over the other?
Okay. So what should you go for Covaxin, Covishield or Sputnik?
Or just wait for Pfizer for that matter?
Pfizer currently is not, they're available, but if it was, should you go for that? My take would be that you should take whatever vaccine is available to you. It's not that we have a surplus of vaccine, and currently the efficacy is almost the same. whatever difference is available is more based on the trial and the way the trials were conducted rather than real life situation. So I would just say that you should take whatever vaccine that you are able to get, but make sure you take it and take both the doses. Any suggestions from anyone else on the panel?
Okay, it seems everybody kind of agrees with that. So the next question on vaccination, how many weeks after you tested positive for COVID?
So that is there in the guidelines also. Neeraj, you want to answer that?
So again, once you get infected, I mean, natural infection, if you get and it's sort of lottery that if you have come out alive of that infection, then you are protected. I mean, that's the best way of protection, I will say, for next 3 to 6 months. So there's no point in getting vaccine immediately after recovering from infection because it's not going to add anything extra. But once the effect of natural infection start waning and you take vaccination, then that will act as a booster for you. So it's prudent to wait for at least 3 months after recovering from the infection. That's what our guidelines currently recommend, and that should be followed at the moment.
Okay, I'm not sure whether you can call it a lottery or not, but that's true that if you natural immunity is much better than what you could get otherwise. But the guidelines say that you must wait for 3 months after having recovered to take the vaccine. Initially, we used to give it after about 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks. But it makes sense to have it after 3 months because you would get some degree of protection due to the vaccine, due to the natural infection itself. So if you take it after 3 months, it's like taking a booster dose. And then you will have a better response as far as the booster dose is concerned, and the immunity will also last for a longer period in time. So better to delay it to 3 months rather than take it too early. Anjan wanted to say something.
No, I have a query for the panelists. That's perfectly fine. Somebody has COVID, was stuck up for 10, 15 days, you wait for 3 months. But what is happening in our country is that once somebody tests positive, the whole family gets tested within the next 3 days, and out of that, 2 will test positive who will have no symptoms. So what do these people do who tested positive? I don't know why did they get tested, but they tested positive, maybe had a running nose for a day and then they are fine. Should they also wait for 3 months? They didn't get a lottery that way.
No, they also got a lottery. They also will get some degree of immunity. It's only that you can debate on the amount of money they won in the lottery in terms of antibodies, but that is a different thing. But even so, if you have got tested and you are positive, you wait for 3 months. If you did not get tested or you were the asymptomatic person who got COVID infection and you don't know that you have COVID, you should take your vaccine whenever your turn comes or whenever you can take it. We know a large number of people would be asymptomatic, but there is really no guidelines or it's not that you must first test your antibodies and then take the vaccine. That doesn't make sense and that's not recommended also.
So when I say lottery, you survived this infection, that is lottery for you. Not you got antibody. You survived this infection, that's a lottery for you. And that's why we should not wait for natural infection to vaccinate us. Rather, we should take vaccine before this type of thing happens.
I have a question for the panelists, and I'm asking this because this is an everyday question which most of us are asked. We tend to get a lot of patients who get positive immediately after the first dose, and they try to pin everything on the vaccine or whatever. So this kind of myth has to be taken care of at a bigger forum, that it is not the vaccine, the first dose, within 2 days you get fever, and maybe somebody has died after the first dose after 5, 10, 12 days. So it is not got to do with the first dose, or this kind of a myth is there in the society. We need to address it.
So that's true, because none of the virus, both the vaccines that we're giving are, one is an inactivated virus, the other is just a viral vector virus. So there is no way that the vaccine can give you COVID-19. But if you go to a vaccination center which is crowded and there is no COVID appropriate behavior, then that can become a super spreading event and you can get the infection from there. So the advice should be that be careful when you go to get your vaccine. The vaccine centers are not sort of secure areas where you cannot get COVID infection. They can be as infectious as any other area. And you'd see that sometimes there's a huge crowd in a vaccination center and there is really no COVID appropriate behavior. So you can get infection there, and that is why it's important to emphasize that point.
Right. A couple more questions just on vaccination, and then we'll close the discussion for today. Vaccination in children in India today, pregnant women, lactating women.
Okay, so lactating women, the guidelines are already there in terms of the fact that lactating women, you can vaccinate, and it also shows advantage because the antibodies are there in the breast milk also, so it may give some protection to the newborn. Pregnancy is still a debatable issue. Most of the international organizations recommend that vaccination should be given to pregnant women looking at a risk-benefit analysis, but the guidelines don't have it. Children, of course, the Bharat Biotech trial is already on. AIIMS is part of that trial, and Pfizer vaccine has already got the approval as far as vaccination in children is concerned. So in due course, I think most vaccine will get approved to be used in children. Currently, of course, only Pfizer has an FDA approval. Any addition that any of the panelists would like to give? Yes, Dr. Juneja, you wanted to say something.
Sir, thanks so much, sir. A very good evening, sir. There was a question regarding, like we were discussing about anxiety and psychosis. My father himself was on ventilator for 10 days. Even right now, he keeps questioning regarding those periods. Like what happened to me during those 10 days and those times, and it causes a lot of insomnia. So many a times without disclosing, he takes Elprex, and he keeps it's a very stressed phase for him. So is taking Elprex or some sleeping drugs for that insomnia justifiable? And he feels quite weak. He was affected in the first week, and I have quite found that a lot of times when the patient gets discharged from private hospitals like Fortis and the doctor, they are given a protein powder pack or something like that, and they think that it is good to keep consuming it so that it gives them energy. So is it justifiable that he keeps continuing it, the protein powder? So that's with small doubt, sir.
So I'll try and answer that, then maybe I can ask Manish to sort of add on to that. From my point of view, anxiolytics like alprazolam can be given for some time. They would help, and one has to be careful in terms of that they don't become habit forming, but otherwise they can be given, and especially when you just come out of COVID, they would be useful both for the insomnia and the anxiety and panic attack that may happen. Protein supplements would not be of much use. I would really encourage more of a good natural diet with protein, fresh fruits, green leafy vegetables, so that there's a more holistic and balanced diet, which is more natural rather than supplemental, and gradual exercise and trying to come back to normal. That would also help. But post-COVID sequelae sometimes can be a big challenge. And like I said, it needs a multidisciplinary approach because weakness is also there. There's stress also. There's mental health issues also. And sometimes there are other complaints which sometimes we are not able to pick up. Like you said, some people have a little bit of a memory loss and they're not able to concentrate and they're not able to remember things. So a very holistic approach is required, which is multidisciplinary.
So yes, sir. So this is not an uncommon problem. We see it. We have seen it in more than 10% of patients. Probably this complaint of palpitation, anxieties, and insomnia. And actually, it happened to a few of my colleagues. So they were wearing Apple Watch, and what they themselves reported it as this tachycardia was there only during the daytime. At sleep, the heart rate went down to baseline normal. So yes, in such circumstances, when we know there is no underlying conditions, a short course of anxiolytic really does help. And yes, natural nutrition, nutritious diet is the best way to go forward, I think. That's it.
Right. Thank you, everyone. So you wanted to say something, Dr. Anjan?
Yeah, I was just trying to remark upon Dr. Juneja. He quoted his father regarding that. It's not uncommon for patients who have been on ventilators and ICUs who go home, they continue to get auditory hallucinations. That's very common when you're sitting there. This has been reported even in residents and nurses who work in ICUs. When they go back to their houses while they're sleeping, they dream of or they hear that bleep of monitor. And whenever patients who have been on ventilator and at times their sedation is not good enough, that feeling of a tube inside the throat and suctioning is a very horrible feeling. So these kind of feelings and lead to tachycardia, and this is not uncommon. So it's only time which will take care of it, and as already mentioned, small amounts of anxiolytic which should be normal.
Right, thank you everyone. There are a few questions still, but many of them are repetitions of stuff that has already been answered. So I request everybody who still has questions to please go to the AIIMS Telemedicine YouTube channel, where the previous seminars and this one will also be uploaded by the end of the day today. And you can run through the same things again. And you even have the previous centers of excellence and the EICUs that were discussed, or not the EICUs, but the grand rounds that were discussed in the past. Thank you everyone once again for being here today. Sir, would you like to round up and close for today?
Yes, so thank you very much. And I'll really start by thanking Dr. Richa Agarwal for her excellent presentation. All my panelists, Dr. Anjan, Dr. Anant Mohan, Dr. Manish, and Dr. Neeraj Nischal, and Dr. Saurabh for being there and patiently answering all the questions. The other panel members also who are there. And I hope that whatever we've learned today, we can really disseminate this to other people in our area, so that this becomes a chain reaction where we can use the good office of the IMA to really disseminate knowledge across our country, so that quality of care improves as far as managing COVID is concerned, and we're able to decrease our mortality and provide the best care for patients, no matter where they are, in urban or rural areas. And physicians are able to really have that satisfaction of doing the best as far as patient care is concerned. Tomorrow we'll have another talk on oxygen therapy, ventilation, and ICU management, which will also be interesting, because again there were a lot of issues which we faced as far as oxygen management was concerned in the second wave, and I think that is also something which is important. Thank you to not only the panelists, to the audience also, and for putting up all these questions on the chat box. And as Rajiv mentioned, if you missed this, you can still see it on the YouTube channel. Thank you once again, and see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.